Welcome to the Catholic OCD Podcast. I am still, despite all my efforts, not Nick Nolfi. I'm Dr. Ben Safranski. In my last video, I talked about the presence of God with Israel in the Old Testament. And today we're going to talk about the presence of God with Christians in the New Testament and in the early church, especially in the Eucharist. All right, so if you watched my previous video, what I talked to you guys about a little bit was how God, in the Old Testament, especially starting in the Exodus, was really, really present with Israel in a way that I like to think of as local, which means not just like his presence in the whole world, not even just like keeping his special eye on Israel, but that he said, look, here's the Ark of the Covenant, okay? I am going to be with you there on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And I'm going to be with you in the temple in Jerusalem. That was a really powerful thing for the Jews. Well, today we're going to go a little bit farther because as Catholics or as Christians, when we talk and think about the Eucharist, of course, where we're really starting is in the New Testament. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on the New Testament because there are lots of people who can talk to you about the Eucharist in the New Testament, but I do want to talk about it a little bit as a way to set up for the Eucharist in the early church. So I'm a church historian, okay? I have a PhD in church history and I have a couple of other degrees in theology, and as somebody who has studied the early church, I can tell you that the early Christians absolutely believed that the Eucharist was the body and blood of Christ in a very real way. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we know that in a little bit. So first I want to set the stage with the New Testament. Now, if you read the New Testament carefully, then the centrality, the fact that the Eucharist, the fact that the Lord's Supper, right, is at the center of the story in the Gospels, and the fact that it is the center of Christian life after the Gospels, so when we get to Acts of the Apostles and when we get to Paul's letters, those things they're right there. They're pretty plain. So you read the Gospels. First of all, you notice that whatever we agree on or disagree on with our Protestant brothers and sisters about what Jesus means when he says, this is my body, this is my blood, one fact that is certain is that those events, the events of that Last Supper, are the absolute the centerpiece of the action in the Gospels, right? The Last Supper, kind of as the lead-in to Christ's crucifixion, death, resurrection is important. So go to any, we could just do a tiny little bit of amateur literary analysis here. Go to any book, just take a work of classic literature, and especially a work where one of the main characters or the main character dies. Go look and see what happens before they die, before they go to their death. You'll realize that in the world of narrative and literature, that is an extremely important moment. And when you read the Gospels, kind of in that same light, you see that what Jesus is doing right before he goes to his death is going to be super important to his disciples. Now, that covers the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but of course, I know what you're saying. You're saying, Dr. Ben, but in the Gospel of John, there is no supper at the Last Supper. There's just feet washing. And you're absolutely right about that, because in the Gospel of John, his discussion of the Eucharist and its importance has been moved to a different spot in the narrative, right? And where is that in the Gospel of John? That's what we call the bread of life discourse in chapter 6, when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Now, one of the interesting things that we often don't notice about that bread of life discourse, which, if you're Catholic, let's say you pay attention in church, you try to pay attention in church, which I only do half the time because my kids are often preventing me from doing that. But if you do pay attention in church, you listen to the preaching, we don't often hear this connection made. It's the fact that the bread of life discourse is part of the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes in the Gospel of John, right? And so what's the miracle of the loaves and the fishes in the Gospel of John? It's Jesus taking a small amount of food and somehow miraculously making it feed as many people as he needs it to feed. And when the people are demanding bread, he gives them a sermon about how he is the bread. Now think about this. If you're an early Christian or you're a Christian, you're a Catholic now, what is one of the amazing things about the Eucharist? The fact that we believe that everyone in the world can receive Christ's body, even though like his physical body when he was on earth was only, whatever it was, 5'9" from Palestine, as Andrew Lloyd Webber says in Jesus Christ Superstar. So you got this 5'9" Palestinian body that somehow feeds everyone across the Catholic Church on a daily or weekly basis. All right. So anyways, so you've got the Last Supper as being central to the Gospels. Then you've got Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, when it talks about what the Christians are doing after Pentecost. It says that they devoted themselves to 4 things: to the teaching of the apostles, to the prayers, to the common life, and to the breaking of the bread. And read that again and think about how we as Catholics devote ourselves to those 4 things in some way, right? The teaching of the apostles, which we do through our study of the teaching of the church and our listening to the voices of the bishops and the church's magisterium, to the prayers, which we are hopefully doing through our daily prayer, the common life, which we do by living in community with each other, taking care of each other, and the breaking of the bread. And I'm here to tell you this, when it says the breaking of the bread in Acts of the Apostles, the earliest Christians knew, the people who were reading Acts of the Apostles, those very early days in the churches, knew exactly what the breaking of the bread meant. It meant their Sunday gathering for the Eucharist. One more example from the New Testament. Go read 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Or as someone has famously called it, go read 1 Corinthians, chapter 11 to 14. And you'll see all about how important it is, not just... St. Paul is basically telling the Corinthians, look, there's this thing that we do called the Lord's Supper. We do it every Sunday, and it is extremely important that we do it the right way. He tells them that the way you treat each other when you're doing the Lord's Supper is really significant for how the community is going to survive, how the community is going to be a community, right? Now, the Lord's Supper that he talks about, that he writes about in 1 Corinthians, looks a little different from our masses or from, the Lord's Supper in years after that, but it's the same thing, and it's absolutely central to the Christian community. All right, so what happens when we get past the New Testament, though? What kind of witness do we see? And here's where things get really really interesting, because one of the things that you learn when you study a lot of church history, if you read you read things from the early church, you start to think about Catholic teaching now, Christian teaching now compared to the early days, is that while everything we believe, all the central parts of our belief, the objective Christian doctrine, if you will, have all been there since the beginning. It's all been there from the beginning, since God speaks those things and God doesn't speak falsehood, and God's truth never changes. The fact is that our ability to understand them and our ability to talk about our ways of talking about our beliefs and the reality of God does change sometimes through history. So things can look a little bit different, but I want to give you a few examples. I want to talk through a couple of examples of how we know that when the earliest Christians went to the Lord's Supper on Sunday, they believed 100% that they were eating the body of Jesus Christ, not a representation in bread, and that they were drinking the blood of Christ, not a representation in wine. So one of the very first examples we have is a guy named St. Justin Martyr. Now he's around in the early 2nd century. He's a Christian. He's really like he's really a philosopher, basically. He's sort of, he's a Christian convert, as most people were, kind of everybody was then. But he comes into Christianity not from Judaism. He comes into Christianity essentially from Greek philosophy. And he writes what we call apologies. So what is an apology? It's not, oh, I'm so sorry for being a Christian. An apology is an explanation or a defense of Christianity that was intended for people outside the church, but especially for the government that was persecuting the church, right? So he addresses 2 of these works called apologies to the Roman emperor when the Christians are being persecuted. And in his second apology, he's describing what it is that the Christians do. Like, what is it that makes Christians unique? Okay, what is it that makes them distinctive from anyone else in the empire? And so he talks about what they do on Sundays. Now, if you read the whole passage, it's going to sound really similar to what we do on Sundays, where you have scripture readings, you have an explanation of the scripture readings, you have a minister leading the prayer, and then you have the very important meal. And this is what St. Justin Martyr writes about the bread and wine that they receive on Sundays. He writes, "We do not receive these things as common bread nor common drink. We have been taught that the food Eucharistized through the word of prayer that is from him is the flesh and blood of that Jesus who became incarnate." All right, now I use that word Eucharistized because it's distinctive to Christian writings in these days, and Justin Martyr uses it basically to say that we've taken this bread and wine and we've done something to it. So he uses this verb in Greek, Eucharistein, which is literally to Eucharist, or to give thanks for. We take this bread and wine and we Eucharist it, and then it is Christ's body and blood. Okay, so this is the middle of the 2nd century. You have a prominent representative of Christianity saying this to the Romans, that we really believe we're eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood. All right, now the second one is even crazier. So one of my favorite, probably my favorite father of the church, the guy that I've written on more than on anyone else, is St. Cyprian of Carthage. You might know Cyprian from the canon, the canon in the Mass, when the priest sometimes during the Eucharistic prayer he starts listing saints, right? Peter, Paul, John, Cosmas, Damian, all that, the apostles, Cyprian, if you listen carefully, Cyprian is in there as the first one mentioned who is neither an apostle nor a pope. He's in there with Cornelius, right? They say Cornelius and Cyprian. And so who was he? He was a bishop of the church in a city called Carthage in the middle of the 3rd century. Carthage is in North Africa. And while Carthage doesn't exist anymore, at that time it was the 2nd most important city in the Latin-speaking world behind Rome. So he's a big deal. And in one of his letters, Cyprian tells a story. So we're talking we're talking in the 240s, okay? 240s, 250s. Cyprian tells this story. And what Cyprian, to give a little bit of background, what Cyprian is concerned about is that while the Christians are being persecuted, there are people in his church who have sacrificed to the emperor as to a god, right? So they've committed idolatry. And then they're coming back to the church to receive the Eucharist. And he's warning them about doing this. He's saying, don't do this. If you've gone and you've offered sacrifice to the pagan gods, and then you've eaten that food that was sacrificed to them, then you are now polluted and can't receive the Eucharist unless you go through this whole period of penance and all that. But what I want you to listen to is this. He tells a series of stories that are kind of like Eucharistic miracles, or sort of like anti-miracles. And one of them he says he saw with his own eyes in a church in Carthage. So take that for what it's worth. And it's a story about a baby. As all good Eucharistic stories starts with a baby. So this baby has Christian parents who have not sacrificed, but unbeknownst to them, the baby's nursemaid has taken the baby and gone to the sacrifices in the town square, offered the sacrifice, and then allowed the baby, and it doesn't say how old the baby is, might be more like a toddler or just an older infant, but gave this child a little bit of the food that was sacrificed to the emperor and doesn't tell the parents. So what happens? Well, the parents don't know this. They take their baby to Mass. And Cyprian writes this. He writes, quote, "The infant in the midst of the faithful, resenting the prayer and the offering that we were making, began to cry convulsively. Moreover, when the sacred rites were completed, when its turn came to receive, it turned its little head away as if sensing the divine presence. It closed its mouth, held its lips tight, and refused to drink from the chalice." Unquote. So if you're familiar at all, if you're like me, you grew up in a Latin-speaking, a Roman Rite Catholic church, then we usually don't receive communion until what we call the age of reason, usually around 7 or 8 years old. But in the Eastern Catholic traditions, babies start receiving the Eucharist right from the beginning, on just a little bit of the precious blood right on the finger of the minister. So that's what's going on in Carthage. So first of all, the baby can sense that God is present in the chalice and tries to refuse to take it. Well, what do? Like whenever, I don't know, if you ever had one of your kids embarrassing you at church, then you just put your head down and you try to force them to be good, and you keep going. So what do? The deacon in the church basically pries the kid's mouth open and forces it to receive from the chalice. And the baby starts choking and vomiting. So Cyprian says, quote, "The Eucharist could not remain in a body or a mouth that was defiled," unquote. Right, this wasn't even the baby's choice. It's not like, it's not like an adult who did something evil comes to the Eucharist and the Eucharist rejects, him or her. This is a baby who was forced to receive a pagan sacrifice, coming to the Eucharist, and basically the Eucharist rejects this child. Now, was I there? Do I know that this happened exactly the way Cyprian says it does? No, I don't know that. And if you're a skeptic, you could say, well, even if it did happen that way, maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the baby was sick, right? And just happened to be choking and throwing up that day. Sure. But the fact that Cyprian writes this in the 250s shows how strongly Christians in the 3rd century believed that Jesus was absolutely and really present in the bread and wine. Okay. And to kind of round things out, I want to give one last example of something from a church father to make you think. This is another one of my very favorite church fathers. This is St. John Chrysostom, who wrote in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. He was also a bishop. And St. John preached a lot on Christians caring for the poor. And in a homily he was giving on John chapter 6 on the bread of life discourse that we talked about before, he says something really interesting. He points out that Judas, even though he received Jesus at the Last Supper, betrayed Jesus and so still was condemned. So in other words, what he's saying is that we do believe this is Christ's true body and blood, but just receiving it doesn't somehow magically save you. Okay? And what John warns us, he says, quote, "When you neglect the poor man wasting with hunger or perishing with cold, that man draws upon you the same condemnation as receiving the Eucharist unworthily. When we partake of the mysteries unworthily, we perish equally with the Christ slayers. When we plunder, when we oppress those weaker than ourselves, we shall draw down upon us severest punishment." Unquote. So John draws this connection between Christ present in the poor that we are not taking care of and in the Eucharist, in saying that we have to be good people. We have to take care of the poor if we want to approach the Eucharist the way that we're supposed to. So what I want to do here is just give you a couple examples of how, like, coming out of the scriptures into the apostolic age, into the post-apostolic age, into the early days of the church, how the Eucharist was absolutely the center of everything for the early Christians. Excuse me, my kids, who I call my little disease vectors, may have given me a virus this week. So what do we do with this? What do we do with these writings of the early Christians? Well, to me, what I think we do is we let them be a witness to us about how the very first Christians understood Christ's teaching, how they understood the Last Supper, how they understood the Bible. These are guys who were taught, in some cases, taught by the apostles what to do and what to believe and how to understand it. And when they receive at the Last Supper, they believe completely that they're receiving the body and blood of Christ. So as we go through this Eucharistic revival, we're going to take that forward, let ourselves be a little bit more revived, hopefully, by the Eucharist, so that we can revive the world around us. And that's gonna finish it for today, for this podcast. And so I want to ask you to please like this video. Please subscribe to the Catholic OCD Podcast. Look for me on my YouTube channel, Dr. Ben Safranski. Look for me on this channel. And come back and see us next time. We're going to be talking about the history of devotion to the Eucharist. Stay tuned.